Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm your host, McKenna Campbell. Before we start the presentation, I would like to share a little bit about the association. ACS is an international association of healthcare professionals on the forefront of cannabinoid medicine. Founded by physicians, ACS is uniquely positioned to advocate for the highest standards in the practice of cannabis medicine. We are an advocacy organization striving to guide lawmakers and regulators at every level of cannabis control. We also prioritize inclusivity and value having members from all walks of life, which motivates us to provide discounted memberships to qualifying groups, as you can see. On this next slide, you can see that there are many benefits to joining ACS. For all of ACS's constituents, we provide evidence and experience-based education to support the premise that cannabis should be treated as medicine. On topic with tonight's event, we will be offering a discount when you bundle our two courses, Terpenes, State of the Data, and Minor Cannabinoids, What Do We Really Know? Normally, each course is $35, but for the rest of July, you can access both for $60. And Kelsey is going to put that link in the chat for us, so you have it right there. So please feel welcome to reach out to us with any questions about membership. For our student leaders, we encourage you to learn more about our Student Ambassador program. And now, I would like to introduce Dr. Jordan Tishler, our resident cannabinoid specialist physician. He is the president of the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, as well as faculty at both Harvard Medical School and Mass General Brigham. He was awarded Clinician of the Year by Americans for Safe Access and Marfan Society. He is also advisor to the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission and Council for Federal Cannabis Regulation. And now, Dr. Tishler, I'm going to stop my screen share and you can share yours and delight us with your presentation.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you for that intro. I realized I was laughing, but laughing with the thing muted.
As long as you enjoyed it.
Right, exactly. All right, let's get my slides up here. Thank you, everybody, for coming. McKenna, you see this over, the slides are up and all good? Fantastic. All right, so we're going to talk tonight about minor cannabinoids and terpenes and what we know and what we don't know being the primary focus. And to some degree, we'll talk a little bit about whether this is usable in any fashion. Again, my name is Jordan Tishler. I'm a physician. I'm the president of the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists and faculty at Harvard Medical School. I usually spend a couple of minutes kind of talking about my background. I think many of you guys have encountered me before. I just typically say, look, my background as a physician is about as conventional as it gets. I've had the pleasure of going through Harvard University 3 times over, at which point we very seriously call ourselves Preparation H. My training is in internal medicine. I never practiced internal medicine. Actually, I went and spent the beginning of my career doing emergency medicine and the latter part of that, 15 years at the VA Medical Center as an emergency room doctor. And I got into this cannabinoids medicine space because, you know, when people started talking about cannabis medicine and I was working in the emergency department, I had that sort of aha moment where I went, you know, I've seen all these veterans who've been so thoroughly harmed by substances. And when I say substances, I really mean on the top 10 list, 1 through 9 is alcohol and maybe a little bit of opioids and benzos, but basically alcohol. I thought, you know, I've never seen anybody sick in the emergency room from cannabis. Now, I know that's changed to some degree now in the setting of legalization, but it certainly appears to be less toxic than many of these other substances. And that led me to think, well, you know, if it's not that toxic and maybe it has some medical use, I should learn something about it. And, you know, way back when I was having this epiphany, people like Mrs. Clinton were running around saying, oh, but there's no data. And it turned out that that wasn't very accurate. If you put the word cannabis into PubMed way back then, you would only get 25,000 studies. And so in essence, the problem became, okay, if you have 25,000 studies, how do you make any sense of this? And that process took me several years. And I came away from that process, you know, convinced that there were enough data to make reasonable medical decisions. and that cannabis was a viable and useful medication, but that like most medications, it was a double-edged sword, and you had to use it with thoughtfulness and caution, and treat it with some respect. And that led to me into practicing this sort of medicine, forming my primary practice. I always say I was never really interested in private practice, but this was the way I could take care of patients. But really, all of this, I think, led to the formation of the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists as a vehicle for doing what we're doing this evening, which is presenting information and education so that we can all be on the same page, and have a good handle on how to take care of patients. As an important note, I want to say that I don't have any conflict of interest that I should be reporting to you, so we can move on with the presentation. Now, the talk is, in fact, sort of in two parts. There's sort of the cannabinoid part and the terpene part. And in each part, I'm going to have this slide where we can sort of define terms and talk about this. But I also want to take a moment before we get into the meat of this to say to you all that I want to apologize up front. I think that this may be one of the most dull talks that I'm ever going to give. And I hope to avoid its being too terribly dull. But if ever any of you have read certain sections of the Bible or the beginning of the Silmarillion, you know that there are these tracts that are just sort of endlessly listing of, so-and-so begat so-and-so who begat so-and-so and all that sort of thing. And I feel like this talk is a little bit like this. It's kind of a long laundry list of alphabet soup. To some degree, that's the reality of the cannabinoid situation. So we'll just try to make this a little bit more fun than it seems likely to be to me. So with all that disclaimer, let me say, look, let's talk about cannabinoids for a second. And I think a lot of this is going to be old news for most of you guys, but I just want to, put it out there. So cannabinoids are chemicals that may have wildly unrelated or divergent structure, but fundamentally interact with the endocannabinoid system. And we all know that mammals and other organisms have this endocannabinoid system that is part of our neurologic and immunologic regulatory system. Endocannabinoids are specifically the chemicals that are used internally as part of that signaling process. And in human beings, there are probably several of them, but the two that have really been delineated at this point are called AEA or anandamide, or 2-arachidonyl glycerol, which is a mouthful, so we just say 2-AG. I'm actually rather impressed that I managed to spit that out without stumbling all over it. And then there are phytocannabinoids, and not included in today's discussion. I have a slide where you sort of look at the structure of these two things side by side, and they're absolutely unrelated visually. But these are chemicals derived from plants, and in particular cannabis sativa, that interact with the human or other species endocannabinoid system. There are well over 100 of these chemicals, but the real issue is that while there are so many of them, we really don't know much about which ones of them are important, and others that may just be sort of along for the ride. In fact, conceivably, there might even be some that are counterproductive. We just haven't really gotten to the point where we understand what they're all doing yet. Clearly, THC and CBD are the most common and the best researched, although I would contend that even CBD isn't all that well researched yet. Oh, come on, computer, let's behave. All right, so since we have acknowledged that THC and CBD are sort of the abundant best known, the list of things that we're going to talk about today don't include those. And so we're going to talk about this particular laundry list, which includes CBDA, CBG, CBC, CBCA, delta-8 THC, THCV, THCA, and CBN. And so, as I've said, this is quite a long laundry list of alphabet soup, and I will try to define these things for us as we go forward. That all being said, this little red box is really the take-home message here. And it's going to recur at least 3 times during this talk. So hopefully that will both bore you and drum it into your head, that the bottom line here is that almost everything that we're going to talk about this evening is preclinical studies, meaning test tubes, rats, things like that. And really that for most of the things we're talking about, there simply have not been adequate human trials yet. And as a result, we as an organization and myself as the presenter strongly discourage the application of these compounds to human beings until we have more data. So with that said, let's launch into our the beginning of the Silmarillion here. So we're going to start with cannabigerol, CBG, CBG, and a number of novel derivatives. That means pharmaceutically derived alterations to the basic cannabigerol molecule have shown promise as anti-inflammatory, neuroprotective in test tubes and animal models, and also some anti-tumor effects, particularly against glioblastoma multiforme. This is a series. This slide presents a number of studies, the first of which being Kogan et al., who have talked about and shown that CBG derivatives, again, these are pharmaceutical versions, can reduce inflammation, pain, and interestingly enough, obesity, which is not something that is commonly talked about with CBG. Particularly, that comes up more with THCV, and we'll get there. CBG is a potential anti-neoplastic or anti-cancer therapy that has shown activity against glioblastoma. Again, not in people, but in test tubes full of glioblastoma cells. And that we've seen CBG quinone derivatives, again, this is a pharmaceutical version, provide some neuroprotection against the development of Parkinson's disease in a mouse model of Parkinson's. And it also has been shown in the mouse model of epilepsy, which is a particular model that is focused on emulating Dravet syndrome, that CBG can be an anti-epileptic. Now, you'll notice the last one here has this big red splotch. I don't know what to call it. It says human data. There are a few of these peppered through the talk to really focus our attention on these few areas where we actually have some human data. So this is published about a month ago, actually, maybe even just a few weeks ago, from Carrie Cutler and Ziva Cooper and Ethan Russo. And this is a really good study. It looks at anxiety and mood. It is a double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover study. And as I was saying, it is well designed. Somebody is holding something up, but I can't unfortunately read it. Oh, is that study? Perfect. So I'm glad to see this is making the rounds, and I think that this falls into the category of now we're getting somewhere, right? But we also have to remember that there were a whopping, I think it was 34 patients in this study, and also not patients, right? These were not people who had, say, generalized anxiety disorder or even social anxiety disorder. These were healthy volunteers who then rated themselves subjectively before and after the use of the CBG on how anxious they felt at baseline. And there were some interesting tidbits buried in this study, and I don't want to spend too much time on this one study, but there was sort of a broad signal that that this helped reduce anxiety, but they also used a number of validated instruments that looked very specifically at sort of subdomains within anxiety, ways of breaking down anxiety into different symptom clusters. And interestingly enough, it was not positive in that analysis. Probably because we were talking about healthy volunteers and only 34 of them. And if we started then to do a study where we had several hundred patients who actually had an anxiety disorder, maybe we would see more. So this is getting somewhere, but again, we haven't gotten to the end of that story. Now moving on to the next fruit salad here, we've got CBC or cannabichromene. Cannabichromene has been demonstrated to have anti-epileptic properties in that mouse model of Dravet, and also has been shown to be an anti-cancer agent potentially against, in this case, bladder cancer cells. So again, here we have cannabis-derived, that's important, compounds of cannabichromene and delta-9, which were shown to interact, which is again an interesting thing, to provide cytotoxic activity against these bladder cancer cells. You know, again, what we don't know really is how much is the CBC and how much is the delta-9 THC, which we also know from other studies is cytotoxic in and of itself. So I think there's more to be written there. Cannabichromene and related phytocannabinoids showing anti-convulsant, again, properties in that mouse model of Dravet. And another one that's really interesting that comes up with a number of both the cannabinoids and the terpenoids is that some of these things seem to demonstrate some antibiotic effect. And given the fact that we have, as everybody is aware, developed a whole lot of resistant bugs recently, particularly these sort of super bugs, the multi-drug resistant organisms, the fact that we can see CBC and CBCA showing strong activity against Staph aureus, which is a particularly nasty bug, this is interesting. Can we use it now? Probably not. But you know, the research will progress, and hopefully we'll get something that is useful for us. Cannabidiolic acid, or CBD, which is the precursor of CBD, or CBDA, I should say, the precursor of CBD, seems to work as an anti-convulsant. There's some evidence that it's actually possibly even better than plain old CBD. Again, the implication that it may be usable as an antibiotic, an anti-inflammatory, and possibly even an antiemetic or an anti-nausea drug. But again, all focused on test tube and mouse models. I've always wondered how you can demonstrate an antiemetic effect on a test tube, but that remains to be seen. So the pharmacokinetics of phytocannabinoids, acids, this is a long name, but the bottom line here is this is a review and particularly focused on CBDA, looking at its effectiveness in the mouse model of Dravet, as we've talked about, that it seems to have improved function against seizure activity, and then interestingly enough, the effect of, again, CBDA as well as D9 THC can be seen to produce an anti-pain phenomena in rodent models of inflammatory pain. And this is one that's induced using carrageenan, which is a thickening agent derived from a red algae, which is one of the reasons why it's amongst the few things I try to avoid in my diet. But this is an interesting approach to showing, to creating inflammation in these rats that then are tested with these cannabinoids. Now let's talk about delta-8 THC. And delta-8, you know, is interesting in large part because we're now starting to see it available sort of on its own, particularly as a hemp-derived cannabinoid. And, you know, we have a whole video and course on the risks associated with hemp-derived CBD and other cannabinoids. So we're not going to focus on this evening, but we need to understand that the risks associated with these hemp-derived cannabinoids really are twofold and not necessarily being discussed with full understanding, right? So one question that is very important is, are these cannabinoids derived and purified and packaged for consumer use in a safe and effective manner And this article that that I wrote with some colleagues and that led to the course on this topic basically postulate that it takes a fair amount of fairly sophisticated chemistry to be able to purify these things to the point of their being safe, and that most of the products that are out there on the market without regulation and testing are probably not purified to a safe degree. So that's kind of problem number one. But the problem number two, which is what I really want to talk about for this evening, is, again, what do we know about the actual chemical? Meaning, even if it's purified, do we really know enough about delta 8 compared to delta 9? And I think that the general answer there is no. As you guys are aware, the native plant does manufacture some delta 8 along with delta 9, but it's infinitesimal by comparison. And so all of the studies that we have done on delta 9, plant-derived delta 9 as opposed to synthetic-derived like marinol, have contained a mixture of D9 with a little D8. And so we can say that there's probably some safety, but if we're really talking now about giving D9 level doses, but we're giving D8 or maybe even higher doses, it's really not fair to extrapolate the safety from D9 to D8. So what do we know about D8 THC? Well, you can see that this page is unfortunately mostly blank. Here is a study that looked at the use of D8 specifically along with CBD and one of these pharmaceuticals to look at corneal pain, right? As a model for inflammatory pain. This again is in a rat model. So basically they take the poor rat and then they scratch its cornea with some sort of an instrument and observe the poor rat's behavior, and then they give them the test chemicals like the delta 8 and see if they react less to the pain that they're having. And here in 2020, the same author group, Thapa et al., did a second set of studies looking more specifically at the use of the delta 8 THC in this thing. So clearly, this demonstrates some utility, but it's a pretty limited model for pain, number one, and number two, again, it's limited to rats. THCV is one, or tetrahydrocannabivarin, talk about a mother mouthful, is another cannabinoid that's getting a lot of press at the moment. I think that there's, again, beginnings of signal, but perhaps a little bit of our getting ahead of ourselves. So THCV seems to have some evidence for neuroprotection. I think you'll notice that almost all of these cannabinoids neuroprotection factors in, and I think that that's interesting, but we have to really start to see what actually works in human beings. The part I think that most people are fairly interested in is the appetite suppression. Can we use THCV in conjunction with, say, ordinary THC as a way of helping patients, say, with pain, but without developing the munchies and leading to increasing obesity and that sort of thing? We've certainly also seen a lot of discussion of THCV around glycemic control and the treatment of diabetes, particularly type 2. So here are our studies. We've seen that THCV has shown some benefit in the Parkinson's model. Again, this is a rat model. And that THCV has been able to ameliorate insulin, this should say insensitivity, in 2 different mouse models of obesity. Skipping just ahead to the bottom here, we see that that there's been some independent confirmation and commentary on the potential benefit of THCV for the management of obesity and diabetes. In the middle, here's one of those studies that's marked as human data. We finally have a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled pilot study. I don't remember how many subjects there were in this. I think it was 12 or 15. So we're not talking about a particularly large study. But what we've seen in this study is that the THCV in particular lowered patients' hyperglycemia and positively affected their liver profile in patients who had type 2 diabetes. And this is tetrahydrocannabinolic acid, or THCA, the precursor of THC. And this has some evidence as helpful for liver inflammation and fibrogenesis that's leading up to cirrhosis, again, in animal models, and may have some function like THCV in maintaining appropriate metabolic function in the face of high-fat diets. And then there's one other element that didn't make it on this slide, it's on the next one. So here we have Hidalgo et al. That really talked about that liver fibrosis and inflammation, again, in a mouse model. This is a relatively recent study. Also in the mouse model, the reducing obesity and preventing metabolic disease in a mouse model where they can induce obesity using high-fat diet and a particular lesion to the rat's brain. So all of those things are kind of interesting. This study from Nalathambi is one that I've actually come to sort of hang my hat on a little bit, because this is an ex vivo human study. So what this means is we have lots and lots of studies looking at cannabis for inflammatory bowel disease, particularly Crohn's disease. And what we found is that ordinary cannabis seems to do a great job of helping these patients with pain and with eating and with quality of life, but that if we look at serum markers or endoscopic markers for the underlying autoimmune disease that is Crohn's disease, we see no change. On the other hand, in this study where they had intact bowel tissue that had been removed from patients surgically because it was necessary for the patient, they were able to treat those organ snippets, if you will, with THCA and show actual histologic changes to the underlying disease process. So this is really the first time that we've seen any cannabinoid, but THCA specifically, really start to modify the underlying autoimmune disease and not just the symptomatology that goes with it. And while this is certainly not in any fashion ironclad evidence, it is some of the best evidence that we have amongst the minor cannabinoids. And I have had a number of patients over the years come in with autoimmune diseases, meaning specifically Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, and rheumatoid arthritis, who have been on conventional medications and doing okay, but not really into remission, get into remission when I've given them the THCA regimen. And so, and particularly THCA is non-intoxicating and seems to have fairly little in the way of side effects. So this has been, at least in my clinic, in a sort of anecdotal fashion, successful over and above what we're seeing in these studies. Cannabinol, CBN. CBN is a really interesting cannabinoid to me because it's another one of these where everybody's talking about how it's useful, and in particular to help people with sleep. And, so we'll talk in a second about what the studies actually show. The studies have shown that there seems to be some anti-UVB radiation effect of CBN, that it may in fact have some antibacterial functions, and that it may in fact be useful on its own for pain. These are a couple of review articles. This one looked at quite a number of cannabinoids, including CBN, and basically concluded that they all had some degree of antioxidant and neuroprotective behavior. Similarly, this study from Vasek looked particularly at the antioxidant function of a bunch of cannabinoids, again, including CBN, in specific under that ultraviolet radiation. And then here in a rat model of myofascial pain in particular, they found that both CBD and CBN and their combinations seem to work as an analgesic or an anti-pain, but again, limited in a rat model. And so here at the bottom now we get a couple of studies that are human-based, and this one from Karun was interesting, cannabinol and sleep separating fact from fiction, and basically the quote from the study, which I think is really illustrative, is most importantly, amongst published trials investigating the association between CBN and validated sleep questionnaires and or formal sleep studies, there weren't any. And so in the end, we have this idea that CBN is good for sleep, except that we've never actually been able to show it. Then we get to this last study, which is, again, only a few weeks old. Well, I guess it's 2023. I thought it was more recent even than that. But Marcus Bonmiller and crew did a really interesting double-blind randomized placebo-controlled study on the effects of CBN and CBD on sleep. Very well designed and executed study, a reasonable number of subjects in each arm. I don't remember, but it was about 100 or 120 in each arm. And what they showed, I think, was very interesting. First of all, we remember that lots of people are out there talking about CBD for sleep. What they showed was that CBD was no more effective for sleep than the placebo, but CBD was. CBD was significantly better for sleep than placebo. They also had an arm where they did CBN and CBD, which was not more effective than CBN alone. So this is the first human evidence that suggests that CBN is in fact useful for sleep. The only problem with this study is that for presumably legal reasons, they didn't have a THC arm. So in the end, we know that CBN may be effective for sleep, but we don't know that it is better than or additional to plain old THC. And it also doesn't give us any reference for if it is additive, how much do we need or want in addition to the THC that we might be using more commonly for sleep. So this is hugely important study. It really does move the ball down the field, but I don't think we're quite in the end zone yet. And don't let my foolish sports analogies fool you. I really know nothing about sports. So that got us to the end of our cannabinoid section, and now we're going to talk about terpenes. So terpenes are aroma chemicals from plants that are simple hydrocarbons. And it's important for us to remember that these aroma chemicals are not unique to cannabis in any fashion. And in fact, unlike the cannabinoids, if you have the right license, you can go to any chemical supply company and buy bottles and bottles and bottles of all these things off the shelf. A terpenoid is a terpene that is modified by the addition of other functional chemical groups on their structure. So you can think of it as a terpene plus. Now, terpenoids can be subdivided based on the size of that carbon backbone. And this is important in terms of how they behave in both the cannabis plant and also in terms of the extraction process. So we have monoterpenes, which have a C10 structure, meaning there are 10 carbons in the structure. And that makes them light and volatile and prone to loss during extraction. And then we have others that are called sesquiterpenes, which are heavier and have a C15 backbone. And these are not as light, not as volatile, and therefore are more commonly retained during the extraction process. And I mention this really just as background. And as we're going through this, I don't really point out which terpenes fall into those categories. I don't think it's all that important for what we're talking about this evening. Pardon me just a second. So as with the cannabinoids, there are many, many terpenoids. And the question is, which ones are particularly relevant to our discussion? And probably most of them are not. So we're going to focus on a small handful of them that you see before us: beta-caryophyllene, myrcene, limonene, alpha-pinene, linalool, eucalyptol, and borneol. And here's our friend, the red box again, right? And it says exactly the same thing as the last one, which is really most of this is preclinical and really not enough done in human beings. So it's probably not ready for prime time just yet. And of course, there will be a few of those little red splotches along the way as we start to see more of the human data come through. So we'll start with beta-caryophyllene. I think generally speaking, this particular section of the talk is, in fact, in somewhat of the order in which we know things about these. So beta-caryophyllene appears to be effective at blocking pain, somewhat regardless of how that pain is induced in the test subject. And again, we're talking about mice. So here is a long laundry list of ways that you can give mice pain. We can give them a chemotherapy-induced neuropathy. We can tie off a limb with a string. We can surgically partially sever the sciatic nerve. We can create diabetic neuropathy or antiviral or neuropathy. And in this case, beta-caryophyllene seemed to be a positive treatment in all of those cases. It was also shown in this particular study to actually prevent pain in this antiviral neuropathy, meaning if you gave it concomitantly, the patient, the mouse, didn't develop the neuropathy. On the other hand, here are two other studies that looked at beta-caryophyllene using a very time-honored, unfortunate technique called the hot plate tail flick test. It's bad to be a mouse or a rat. These guys take the poor rat with and without treatment, and they drop their tail onto a hot plate and measure how long it takes the rat to go ouch and move its tail. I'm glad I'm not a mouse. Myrcene, what do we know about myrcene? Here's a review that looks at a number of studies. In this first section, we've got some human data, right? Unfortunately, it was only 5 subjects, so there's not a lot to hang your hat on, but at least it was human beings. And the bottom line is it showed that there was anxiolytic and sedative effects from myrcene, and therefore not an unreasonable therapeutic. And then there was also some stuff about various EEG changes that sort of mimicked meditation. There was evidence for its being anti-inflammatory. This again was done in cell culture, and that we see that there's evidence again for its being an analgesic. This again is mice because we don't give medicines intraperitoneally to humans. But the bottom line is that there was value there. And they actually went so far as to show that by using naloxone and yohimbine, they were able to block the positive effect. So it's a double negative. But what that demonstrates is that the effectiveness of the myrcene is caused through a mixture of the opioid system and the adrenergic system, giving us a better understanding of the pain pathways, but also lending credence to the fact that there is some specificity in these discoveries. Limonene is an interesting terpene. It's a monoterpene, which means that in many cases in manufactured products, there isn't any limonene unless it's been deliberately retained and added back. I think that limonene is very widely discussed, and my basic take on it is that people like the name limonene. Here are a couple of reviews, this one in particular on the therapeutic effects, showing that it is well tolerated in experimental animals, that there seem to be some neuroprotective effects, and also some cardiac and liver protective effects, but that those studies really have not lived up to the hype. And there have been some limited studies suggesting that it might have some anti-cancer effects on its own. And that their conclusion really was the study of limonene in human beings was just extremely limited and really couldn't be summarized. On the right, there's a review that looks more at limonene's usefulness as a pharmaceutical and that there seemed to be, again, some evidence of anti-neoplastic activity. As Ananda Kumar and et al. Said later, probably not enough to hang our hat on. It's shown to have some low metabolic and bioavailability, but that it can help with things like passing through the blood-brain barrier. And so it may be useful less on its own and more as an excipient in the formulation of novel drugs, particularly in the use of nano formulations. This is, again, a hot off the presses study. This was done by a number of folks, including Ethan Russo, that looked at the utility of limonene as an adjunct to THC, with the thought that it might mitigate some of the excessive intoxication and anxiety/paranoia that we can see with excessive dose of THC. This is a human study. They used high doses of THC, and their definition of high dose was 15 milligrams or 30 milligrams. And then to that, they added increasing doses of limonene, either 1 or 5 milligrams. And what they showed was that this was indeed found to decrease the anxiety. They also had a sort of special arm of the study at the end of the study that used sort of, again, a very high dose of limonene with the highest dose of THC. And what they said was that, in fact, the really high dose of limonene was the best at mitigating the anxiety. And I think that this is particularly interesting because not only of what they're showing, but we also have to remember that 15 milligrams of limonene is not something that you're going to find in cannabis, right? So that this is clearly going beyond the plant biology into the realm of pharmaceutical development. This study, I think, was, again, complicated by the fact that there were only 20 subjects, and they were all healthy volunteers. None of them had baseline anxiety. And then for that final arm where they showed the best benefit, only 12 subjects consented to that, to participate in that. So I think, again, this is a very strong signal. It's a very important first study. It needs to be replicated, and it needs to be replicated at a greater scale. Let's then talk a little bit about alpha-pinene. Again, a review from 2021 showing that alpha-pinene can, by multiple routes, enter the brain, cross the blood-brain barrier, that it has direct effects on basically every neurotransmitter system that we have, right? GABA, cholinergic, dopaminergic, serotonergic, adrenergic, noradrenergic. Not sure they left out anything. The evidence is limited, but there's some evidence, again, that it can be anti-inflammatory, anti-oxidative, perhaps antidepressant and anxiolytic, has some anti-seizure properties. So there's, again, this sense that there's something there, but we don't really have enough data in human beings. They comment that there have been several studies that have shown that pinene is similar to or better efficacy compared to existing medications in some indications. I'm not sure how exactly they're making that statement, but I will agree that these require replication and understanding better of the dosing and safety of pinene. It's interesting that Zoom has all of your pictures right over my slides, so I'm having trouble reading some of the words here, so I'm moving everybody over there. So linalool is another common monoterpene, and there's some evidence, again, in the test tube that it can kill cancer cells, particularly by radical scavenging, and may in fact be specific to these tumor cells and not just sort of randomly killing any or all cells. Has some neuroprotective, hepatoprotective, and renal protective properties, and interestingly, some protection of the lung. Makes me wonder a little bit if this might contribute to the fact that we don't see patients who smoke cannabis getting lung cancer, for example, the same way we see tobacco smoke. I think that that's a very interesting question that we've not really tried to unravel, but I think it would be wildly important. And maybe it's the linalool, maybe it's THCA, right, which obviously is abundant. It needs to be investigated. It seems to have some antimicrobial properties in itself. It can be used as a natural food preservative, but its application, as they say, is limited by the fact that it's not terribly water soluble. This is a problem that we see a lot in these cannabis related compounds. And so that does pose some issues for using it therapeutically. Eucalyptol, otherwise known as menthol, by the way, this is the same stuff, seems to have some anti-inflammatory benefit, particularly in respiratory diseases, not unlike what we were just talking about. There may be some benefit cardiovascularly and to neurodegenerative diseases. It can be used as a mucolytic agent. I'm not sure how that in relation to anti-inflammatory is relevant. It's probably two separate issues. We've seen it be helpful for the reduction of shortness of breath relative to placebo in patients with COPD. So this, again, probably should have the little red splotch. Here we have some actual human data. Maybe there's some neuroprotection involved. There's been some evidence that it may increase or decrease hypertension, and similarly reduce heart rate, but not clear that these effects have significant value, again, in human beings. And this is the last one on the list of long fruit salad, which is borneol. And borneol, here are two studies, one looking at the use of borneol as an intervention in stroke. Again, most of this is rat data, so that we're looking at question of whether using borneol can prevent the extension of and the consequences of stroke. There's been evidence that it will protect neurons by blocking calcium overload, as well as scavenging radical oxygen species. It may interact with the blood-brain barrier to help reduce neuron death. and may in fact promote neurogenesis and angiogenesis, blood vessel development at the later stages of recovery from a stroke. So that's the clinical one. And then again, here we've got one that's really much more focused on borneol as being an excipient in pharmaceutical agents, so that we see that this can readily traverse the various barriers in the body, that it's lipophilic and small, that it has direct inhibition of the ABC transporter proteins, as well as modification and loosening of tight junction proteins like claudins and occludins. And therefore, again, the idea of using borneol not so much as the therapeutic, but rather as an adjunct to some other therapeutic by loading this into nano-formulated drugs may increase the efficacy and utility of whatever that primary drug may be. I'm trying to get this thing out of my way again. That's not what I wanted. Where did my slides go? What is this thing doing? All right. Next slide really is the almost the end of the slide. I realize that we're running quite late on time. If people are willing to stick around, I will stick around because I do want you guys to ask questions. So just to summarize, on the cannabinoid side, we see that there's a lot of exciting work on a wide array of cannabinoids. The most promising so far is probably the THCA as an anti-inflammatory. Next up would be CBG and THCV as anxiolytic and metabolic regulator, respectively. But really, there are not adequate human studies at this point. Again, I'm now on the terpene side. Again, wide range of effects that look very interesting, mostly studied in rats. I think it's fairly clear that that caryophyllene and myrcene are viable therapeutics at this point, though certainly we'd like more studies to delineate that. Limonene, pinene, and linalool look good, but I think need further data, and eucalyptol and borneol are probably not super good as on their own as therapeutics, but look very interesting as ways to develop these nano formulations that will make things work better. And then, of course, there is our friend we've all gotten used to, the red box, which really just wants us to remember that, in fact, there's really a paucity of data across most of these compounds, except as we've talked about tonight. And even there, we certainly could use bigger and better studies to prove the points. And so we need to be quite cautious about what we're telling our patients, particularly since many of these chemicals are now freely available in various jurisdictions or on the web from hemp sources. I too will make a pitch for people to join the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists. Our focus, as you've seen, is on education for clinicians, but also for regulators and lawmakers, with the idea being that the current systems really are not helping us take care of our patients very well, and that we would like to see more science and better regulation so that we can do a better job of taking care of our needy patients. And I think McKenna will give another little plug for that, but that is the end of my slides. So with that being said, let's have some questions.
Well, awesome. Thank you for a great presentation. And yes, I'm always here to pitch ACS and all things we can do, including that bundle we talked about earlier that is in the chat if you want to keep learning more. We do have some questions already in the chat, so I'm going to start with those. And then if people have more questions after those are done, I would be happy to get those in. So I think the first question was about, yeah, so CBT is showing up in TreeWorks tinctures. Just asking if you have any idea about that.
I'm sorry. What is the acronym that we're talking about?
It says CBT.
CBT as in Thomas?
Yes. Yeah, if the person who asked the question wants to jump in.
Okay.
You are welcome to, just to any clarifying information.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Tishler.
Oh, hi.
It's in the TreeWorks tincture, the relief, just with the whole list of them, CBG, CBN, CBC, all of them. But CBT, I can't find anything on it. So,
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, the only use of the initial CBT that I'm aware of is cognitive behavioral therapy. So I'm just doing a quick little Google, and let's see what it's cannabisitran. I will say I have never heard of this. And then here's something else that comes up as cannabitriol. I don't know if these are the same things. All right, well, this is a completely unreputable source that I'm finding. This, on the other hand, is from some sort of biopharma. So let's see if they say anything useful.
Hi, Dr. Tishler. It's Kent Crowley.
Oh, hey, Kent, how are you?
Oh, great. Thanks for a great talk. I just wanted to mention that in our work with hemp extracts, CBT seems to be in the 10% range when you're dealing with a lower concentration. They call them crystal resistant distillates. So they have a broader selection of minor cannabinoids, and CBT tends to be pretty high compared to CBC and CBG, actually, unless there's been some modification to the hemp plant.
That's
But
very interesting.
clinically, I have no idea.
All right, well, I'm looking at a site which is I'm not sure how reputable, right? And it's saying based on limited anecdotal testimony, CBT appears to be non-intoxicating with effects that resemble those by CBD and CBG. And that it is most commonly used as an anti-crystallization ingredient to help CBD resist reverting to its natural crystalline state. I'd have to say, apparently this was first synthesized in 1971, and that that there is an analog that is isolatable from rhododendrons of all things. But beyond that, I don't see in this summary that I'm looking at any real convincing evidence that that we know anything about it. The fact that it's in the TreeWorks product, how do I say this vaguely politely? I think it's concerning that there are products out there that have a myriad of ingredients in them that are measurable and itemizable, and yet we don't know anything about them. And I would waggle my finger at the TreeWorks guys, except that they're certainly not unique in that regard. And this really gets me to sort of one of my basic premises, which is I think we need to know a lot more about these things before we start unleashing them on humanity. But, that's the soapbox.
I'll say
Thank
I
you for the
saw
stumper question.
I see a webpage, GVB Biopharma.
That's what I was reading from. Yeah.
And as I scroll down, it goes from an informational thing to basically a sales pitch. I think they extract it, then sell it to other companies to put in their product to keep the CBD from crystallizing. And then they also say, add it because it can be a new thing for, marketing thing for you.
And I think that therein lies, the rub in this industry, that just, graze my hair on a day-to-day basis. But you're absolutely right. That company is not necessarily the most reputable source, because even if what they're saying is accurate, it's folded into this sales pitch. And I would certainly prefer to go looking in the scientific literature, but that would take, a few hours of digging around in PubMed. Fred, you have your hand up, so let me.
So I'm gonna go down the organic chemistry side. Is my audio okay? Okay, good. CBT is an oxidative product of THC, just as CBN is a degradation product of THC. And according to the chemical sources I have in here, it's a degradation product they find in patients who, or they find in plant material as a old product, the same way they found CBN 100 years ago and analyzed it first. And the other is it's, being an oxidative product, it's also found in patients. It's a metabolite in patients, one of the oxidative things of THC, beside going down the other pathways of 7 and 11. So I think they're finding a way to use an old byproduct. I call it rust.
Well, that's a fair analogy. Unfortunately, we don't necessarily know that it's effective for anything or safe for anything, but there it is. I think the problem is that, THC as sort of the prototype molecule, and maybe that's not even fair. Maybe we should be looking at CBG as the prototype, the mother cannabinoid. The point is that it is a very complex molecule where you can make all kinds of interesting substitutions on the tails, on the rings, and get all manner of things. We see obviously just moving the double bond around the ring changes things. So I think, there's a lot to be done there to sort of elucidate what these changes mean, chemically, clinically, safety, all of that sort of thing. McKenna, what do we have next?
So let's see. We do have a hand up.
Okay.
Daniel, if you want to ask a question, if it was relevant to what we were just talking about.
Thank you very much. I hope it's relevant. Hello, Dr. Tishler. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Daniel Dvorsky. I've been working with a unique cold extraction process that secretes an oil real rich in minor cannabinoids as well as canaflavin, because it's a whole plant extract with the leaves. I started taking a few drops a day, 3 to 4 times a day, 45 days ago. I have hyperthrombosis. My platelet count has dropped from an average of 698 to 537 in 45 days. My hematologist is blown away, but for obvious reasons, he's prohibited from basically even acknowledging or saying anything, but keeps an eye on it. I'm interested in finding someone like yourself or anybody that can help direct me to perhaps put some sort of a study together, because this is a condition I've been told for 15 years is untreatable.
Number one, I'm pleased as punch to hear that your numbers are better.
Me too. Me too.
I don't know whether that decrement necessarily means something significant. But it's interesting, and
yeah,
I think,
it's interesting.
Trying to understand what's in that oil would be very interesting.
I have the COAs. I'm happy to show you anything you want to see.
Yeah, I think in the interest of time and other people's level of interest, why don't you email me stuff and let me give it some thought. And I'm not sure what will come of it, but it's a worthy discussion.
Should I we are connected on LinkedIn, I believe. Should I just try to find it there, or do you have an email I could reach you?
president@cannaspecialist.org.
Oh, I didn't hear that. I'm sorry.
president@cannaspecialist.org.
Oh, that's a cool one.
If you just go to the website, you can email info@, and it'll go to Kelsey, who can send it to me.
Thank you very much.
Sure, anytime.
Okay, great. I'm also very happy to hear that your health is doing so much better, by the way. Um,
Thank you very much.
of course. Another question from the chat. It's kind of quoting you here, Dr. Tishler. It says, asking what the THCA regimen that you are speaking about, if you could go a little more into detail.
I can, but I can't say that it's based on science. At some point, I looked at the study that I had referenced, the nalafambi, which gave dosing not in human beings, but again in this ex vivo, and I extrapolated from that, which is not necessarily a fair thing to do. And so the regimen that I have used that seems to be effective is starting at 10 milligrams twice a day. Its effectiveness seems to be fairly slow. I sort of think of it as like an SSRI in that regard. So I usually give people a 6-week trial on any dose. And if that works, wonderful. And if it doesn't, then I double it. And so it would be 10, 20, 40, 80 over each one with a 6-week trial. And what I found in general is that if you get up to 80 twice a day and it isn't working, it isn't going to work. And I would be the first to admit that that is not a scientific approach, but that seems to be effective for many of my patients. I have some patients who have gotten good relief at only 10 milligrams twice a day. I think most of my patients are in the 20 to 40 range. And then I have a few patients. I have one patient in particular that I don't really understand at all. She takes THC for insomnia, but she has arthritis pain, so non-inflammatory pain, and she will take like 3 milligrams of THCA acutely, not prophylactically. And so as far as I can tell, that shouldn't work at all. But she says not only does it work, but it works better than the THC. I would make out of that a psychological phenomenon, but it is always interesting, in the care of patients to see how people react. But anyway, that is sort of my general rubric for the THCA.
Perfect. Thank you. Another question we have is referring to the borneol study. How did the doses used compare to the quantity found in cannabis sativa?
They're nowhere near the doses found in cannabis, meaning way more than we find in the plant species. And I don't think that those studies were really thinking about the therapeutics of the cannabis. They were really focused on the therapeutics of the borneol itself. And so these are relative to the plant, these are mega doses.
Great. And then lastly from the chat, I talked to Janice outside in her own message. She had several questions, so I just wanted to give her the opportunity to ask you directly and phrase them how she wants to. So Janice is going to take over for me for a minute.
Sorry, lots of questions. And I think a lot of them went to McKenna because I was replying and then I by mistake here. Couple random things. I know that CBD will in high doses affects livers, causes LFT elevation. How do some of these other things like the CBG, which you were mentioning, that has seizure protective ability, how does that affect the liver? Do we know?
No, we don't. But it's a very interesting thought. I'm inferring from what you said that, look, if CBD turns out to be more complicated because of this liver toxicity and drug interactions, could we use another cannabinoid like CBG in its stead? And I think the answer to that is, I think it's a great idea. But you have to remember that most of what we know about CBD comes from the GW/Jazz pharmaceutical research. So the fact that nobody has yet done that kind of product development around CBG, although Jazz is working on it, I don't think we've seen that kind of toxicity data put forward yet.
Okay. And then
sadly.
would you recommend like a full spectrum cannabis then for seizures? Like, as opposed to just, THC or CBD, have you found that maybe like something that has all of the different products in it to be a little bit more beneficial
Um,
or not? Or maybe we don't know.
Well, here's what I'll say. There is, to my knowledge, one study that looks at what they called artisanal CBD preparations compared with, I don't know if it was compared, it was compared against placebo or something like that. The point being is the question that needed to be asked is, does the CBD that people are getting off the shelf work at all or in any way comparable to the Epidiolex? And to my knowledge, there is one study that shows some efficacy. Other than that, I think that the idea of using sort of off-the-shelf CBD products, whether they're isolates or full or broad or whatever, I think doesn't have a lot of data behind it. And patients come to me who don't fit within the parameters that GW looked at for the development of Epidiolex. I tend to tell them that I don't think that this is a good therapeutic option unless they're sort of, again, at the end of the rope, right? Meaning, if they've been through all of the standard anti-epileptics, then I think it's not unreasonable to give a try. But I think it's unreasonable to sort of to pretend that the data are sufficient, that it's really up there in the pantheon with these other drugs. And of course, the other question is, because we have Epidiolex, and for the most part, it's covered by insurance, is it better to be sending these people or these parents to the dispensary to buy a tincture of some sort versus writing them a prescription for Epidiolex?
Makes sense.
And I think, and in the few cases where this has come up for me, the answer in that case has been driven by, let's call your insurance company and ask whether they will cover the Epidiolex or not. And if the answer is not, then we'll use the tincture because it's cheaper. And if they will cover it, then we'll use the Epidiolex because it's a more sure bet.
Yeah, I run into that with dronabinol, where insurance more often than not doesn't cover it. But
Which is very interesting, isn't it? Since it is an FDA approved drug and it's been around for a bajillion years. But I can tell you this, dronabinol is not cannabis. And even taking dronabinol and concomitantly taking a full spectrum CBD tincture does not equal cannabis. And that's purely an anecdotal observation. But using myself as guinea pig, I have done this, and there's something going on in the plant-derived materials that this does not replicate. What that is, I have the faintest.
Another geeky question.
I like
C fiber, A delta fiber. I'm not sure if everyone's as familiar with the pain spectrum. Pardon, I pulled the palliative care in me out. As you may or may not know, C fiber pain is inflammatory pain, whereas A delta is the sharp pain that localizes, "Ow, I burned my finger." That throbbing pain afterwards is C fiber pain, and which is why anti-inflammatories probably help more with the inflammation of bone pain, and why steroids probably help with the visceral pain of, like, visceral cancer pain and stuff, rather than opioids. Geeking out for a second. But the question is, you had several studies where you talked about pain and these different extracts, and with either the terpenes or the different types, and like the eye pain study with the where they scratch the
corneal
eye,
abrasions, yeah.
right, the corneal abrasions, and then there was a whole bunch of ones like with the tail and the cutting off and stuff, and I was curious, which ones was it? Because it was in these studies, did they talk about whether it was the inflammation component, decreasing the C receptor pain? Because the endocannabinoid, or not the endocannabis, but the cannabis product decreased inflammation and thus decreased the feedback to the C receptors? Or was it central and it decreased the striatonegral, stimulated the inhibitory pain pathway from the striatonegral by the endocannabinoid system?
I think those are really great geeky questions. I don't think that any of these studies have gotten quite that deep. Some of these studies, like the one I mentioned in which they used naloxone and yohimbine as a blocker, started to elucidate that which pathways were involved, meaning the opioid pathway versus the adrenergic pathways. And those I think are neither truly peripheral nor truly central. I mean, they're central in the sense of cord or medulla level, rather than the higher function. But beyond that, I don't think we know. My guess is that most of these rat studies are looking at acute reactions. So therefore, that would be A fibers more so than C fibers, right? In that if you drop the rat's tail on the hot plate, that's the A fiber.
Well, that would be A fiber, and that's why I was wondering if that's why it failed, was because that one stimulated A fiber, whereas like constricting
all the
an
other
arm
neuropathic ways
might be more of a C fiber.
I think that's brilliant.
Definitely the eye. So that's why I was like wondering, are we dealing more with inflammation or are we dealing more with stimulation of the, inhibitory pathway?
I think that these are really, really
But
great
no, yeah.
observations, but I don't think that we have that information yet. And the other thing that I would point out is that if we look at the ways in which THC alone interact with these pain pathways, it's not any one place. That THC will interact, at the skin receptor as well as at the cord level and the thalamic level and the cortical level. And so the question really in some ways is, are any of those sites particularly more important than any of the other ones, or is it some sort of cumulative effect? Does the benefit vary depending upon the particular type or location of pain as it relates to these various centers where the THC gets involved? Lots and lots of good research, if we can just get the government to put up some dollars for grant funding.
Right. A couple more geeky questions. Any of these terpenes break down when smoked, or are these all extracted during smoking?
The ones that we talked about this evening make it through the smoking process into the human being.
Okay, that's what I was curious about. And then and everything crosses the blood-brain barrier. Is there anything that doesn't?
Of the ones that we've talked about this evening, I don't think any of them don't.
Yeah. Let me see.
There has been some pharmaceutical research looking at ways to modify THC, for example, so that it would not cross the blood-brain barrier, with the theory being then it would be non-intoxicating, but it would have peripheral anti-nociceptive effects. I don't think that's been wildly successful, but it's all being developed in a proprietary system. So I just don't know how much research has yet to be published. Getting back to my previous comment about the fact that THC interacts in so many locations, many of which are on the central side, I think it's quite possible that the attempt to get around the intoxication by excluding it from the brain would derail its therapeutic benefit.
It might, yeah, especially and then this limonene that you talked about with anxiety. So do you see a future where like a high dose THC gummies in the medical use might routinely have limonene added to mitigate the side effects of anxiety, since the high dose THC that can cause it? And
I certainly think that's the working hypothesis. I would counter that a little bit the statement that in patients who start de novo and therefore have no inherent, not inherent, but acquired tolerance to THC, high doses of THC are probably not necessary. And so in many ways, just using a smaller, more moderate dose avoids some of that complication. So if
Okay.
you don't need a much higher dose, is there really a lot of value in developing a pharmaceutical that has the limonene in it to mitigate it? I mean, you'd have to really figure out what the use case is.
Gotcha. No, that's okay. I know I'm throwing a lot of geeky questions on. And the last one was you mentioned about one of them helping with diabetes. Is that in very, very high doses, or is that in physiologic like cannabis doses, you
Oh,
know?
no. That's it. Super therapeutic, super physiologic. Again, extracted, concentrated, and then administered. So that, I think that most of the studies on THCV have looked at doses sort of between 10 and 15, 10 and 20 milligrams. And, what you get out of smoking a joint is less than a milligram. I mean, it's tiny, it's infinitesimal. Even in strains that are supposedly high in THCV, like Durban poison, it's still minuscule.
Okay. And then THCA, you're able to get it for your patients? I mean, that's just at a dispensary they have those, or?
Well, remember that THCA is the precursor of THC. So when you get raw bud, that's what you're getting, right? And then in the process of smoking or vaporizing, you're decarboxylating that into THC. So that we have one or two dispensary groups in my area that actually have THCA products that aren't necessarily all that reliably available, but at least they exist. But most of the dispensaries do not carry this. And I think it's, again, a testament to maybe to some degree, lack of knowledge on the scientific side. But I also think that, there's a lot of these dispensaries are thinking about getting high. The nice thing is that THCA is easily extractable into a tincture by oneself. And in fact, on my practice website, there's a little search bar, and if you type in THCA, you'll get a few articles on it. But one of those articles is a recipe for how to do a cold extraction to generate a THCA tincture that is done in a measured fashion so that you actually then know what the dosing is. And I would say that some of my patients have done that, and most of them have come back to the conclusion that it was worth it to them to schlep in to find the dispensary that would make it for them. And so I think most of my patients are on commercial versions, but at least it's available as an option with THCA, which it wouldn't be for THCV, for example, because you just couldn't extract enough of it.
Okay. Interesting.
So are there any burning questions, or should we call it an evening?
Thanks for.
There was one last, oh, it's kind of a more of a comment on what we were just talking about, but she said so juicing leaves or chewing on raw buds might be the best source of THCA. Question mark.
Yes, I mean, I think that juicing the leaves is probably not going to lead to a whole lot of THCA, because it's not going to lead to a whole lot of anything. I mean, in fact, when dispensary groups make these things, they use leaves, right, to extract the oil, but then they use a process by which they concentrate this down so that you start with a ton of material and you end up with a batch of pens. So I don't know that juicing whole plant is going to lead to a whole lot of cannabinoids. Chewing on dried bud sounds miserable, and it's probably not going to be a whole lot of. At that point, I would say, look, go get some alcohol, do the extraction following the recipe, and you'll end up with something that's more precise and not quite as disgusting to put in your mouth.
Yeah, less disgusting is probably better. But yeah, if that's all for questions, want to thank everyone for coming. Dr. Tishler, thank you for this great talk. Once again, we did just re-add the link to the bundle in the chat if people want to look at that or any of our other educational courses, they're always available. But yeah, have a great night,
And
everyone. Thanks for hanging in with us.
where would this be posted? Or will this be posted anywhere, this lecture?
Oh, in the chat. We put
No,
the
no,
link to the bundle.
The recording will go onto our YouTube channel, and then it will be linked to our website, and we'll probably be bouncing it out to social media. So there should be ample opportunity for you to see the videos.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure. All right, everybody. Well, thanks so much for coming and participating, and I hope that this was valuable to you, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Man, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.